I'm Emily, and I'm going to show you how to stack a tier cake. Start by building your cakes. Secure the first layer of cake to a cardboard cake board using a dollop of frosting. Make sure each layer of cake is perfectly level, trimming it with a serrated knife so the top is flat. I like to drizzle each layer with simple syrup to keep it nice and moist. Don't put too much filling in between your cake layers, or it will ooze out under the weight of the cake and frosting or fondant on top of it, making a bulge in your outer layer. If you're using fondant, use a filling that's fine at room temperature because you won't be able to refrigerate your cake after covering it with fondant. Flavoured buttercreams work well, but avoid whipped cream or custards. Turn the top layer upside down so the flattest part of the cake is facing up. That's the part that was in the bottom of the cake pan when you baked it. After building your cakes, chill them in the freezer for about 30 minutes or in the fridge for about an hour. I like to wrap mine in cling film or saran wrap to make sure they don't dry out at all. When the cakes are chilled, use a serrated knife to trim around them so that the outside is even. This is important so that the fondant has a nice smooth covering, but if you're going to cover the cake with just buttercream, you can skip this step. Trim the cake board so that it's the same size as the cake. Repeat these steps with every tier of your cake. Sometimes you'll want one of your tiers to be taller than the other, but if you want them to be the same height, put them side by side and trim the taller one to match the shorter one. Chill the cakes again for a few minutes so that they firm up again. Then frost them with a crumb coat, which is a very thin layer of frosting. If your cakes are cold, the frosting is less likely to pull off crumbs from the cake. You can finish off the cakes with a final coat of buttercream or with fondant. If you're using fondant, roll out your fondant to about 1/4 inch thick. When you roll, push your rolling pin mostly downwards and a little bit away from yourself. If you just roll away from yourself, you'll stretch the fondant and it will tear. It's a good idea to rotate the fondant after every few rolls to make sure it isn't sticking to the table or countertop underneath. If it starts to feel sticky, sprinkle some more powdered sugar or cornstarch underneath. I prefer sugar because I find that cornstarch dries out my fondant too much, but both work. Buttercream frosting usually crusts about 30 minutes after you frost a cake. If this happens, you'll need to brush it with water or simple syrup so the fondant sticks nicely to it. I prefer simple syrup, which is just equal parts of water and sugar simmered together until all of the sugar dissolves. Lift your fondant carefully and place it over the cake, making sure you center it so there's enough fondant to hang down and cover the sides. Use a fondant smoother to rub down on the top of the cake so that the fondant is smooth and flat. Lift out the fondant that drapes around the cake and rearrange it so it's pressed flat against the sides of the cake. If your hands start sticking to the fondant, which might happen if your hands are warm, rub them with a bit of powdered sugar. Then use a fondant smoother to rub around the sides of the cake, smoothing the fondant against the cake. Use a sharp knife or a pizza cutter to trim the excess fondant from around the cake, and then lift the cake onto a sturdy object smaller than the base of the cake. I usually use a cake stand, which I turn upside down for smaller cakes. Now you can rub all around the cake with your fondant smoother because the table or countertop won't block you from the bottom part of the cake. Use 2 fondant smoothers, holding one horizontal on top of the cake and then the other vertical against the side of the cake. Push the horizontal smoother from the inside to the outside of the cake and the vertical smoother from the bottom to the top of the cake so they meet at the edge of the cake. This pushes the fondant and pinches it to make the edges sharp. Keep going all around the cake. The excess fondant is hanging straight down from the cake, so you can use a sharp knife to trim it. Hold the knife horizontal, being careful not to angle the handle upward because you'll trim the fondant too much on the outer edge of the cake, exposing the cake board. It's important to do this step quite quickly after lifting the cake off the table or countertop, because otherwise the weight of the fondant will drag down and it might tear the fondant. Now cover the next tier with fondant. It's important to knead the fondant before rolling it out because it warms it up and makes it nice and pliable. If you roll it straight away, you'll get creases and tears in your fondant. Once your fondant feels supple, you can roll it out. Brush your cake with water or simple syrup, place the fondant over it, and rearrange the draping fondant. Trim off the excess fondant, use fondant smoothers on the top and sides, and clap the smoothers together to make sharp edges. Now we're ready to stack the cake. Place a dollop of frosting on the cake board to secure the bottom tier of cake. All of your cake tiers will be on their own cake boards, but we want to put the tiered cake on a bigger cake board for presentation and so that it's easier to transport. Now we're going to put poles in the bottom cake to support the cake on top. place the cake pan of the smaller cake on the larger cake to see where the support needs to go. You're going to place the support in a square formation inside of where the smaller cake will sit. All of the straws need to be exactly the same height, so the top cake will sit flat on top of them. To measure them, stick one straw into the cake and mark where it sticks out of the fondant. Cut it here. Then hold it up against the next straw and cut that straw in the same place. Repeat for all of your straws, measuring them against the original straw to check they're all the same size. You can buy cake dowels specifically for this purpose, or use boba straws, which are wider and stronger than normal drinking straws. Place them into your cake, checking from different angles to make sure they're going straight down into the cake, not at a diagonal. Make a square, and you can also place a straw in the centre. I'm not using a centre straw for this cake because it's only 6 inches wide, but for 8 inches or bigger I would place a straw in the centre. Spread a bit of frosting in the middle of the cake and place the next tier of cake on top, centering it in the middle of the cake. The frosting will stick to the top tier's cake board and prevent it from sliding around. And there it is, ready to decorate. Now you can add borders around the base of each tier and then your decorations. If you're frosting your cake with buttercream instead of fondant, the technique for stacking the cake is the same. Once you've applied your final coat of frosting, measure your boba straws or dowels and insert them into your cake. You can do this before or after placing your cake on the baseboard. Spread a bit of frosting in the middle of the cake, which the next cake will stick to. Lift up your top tier and place it carefully on top of the bottom tier. It's easiest to do this with a chilled cake because if you touch part of the frosting by mistake, you won't mess it up because it's chilled and firm. Now you can decorate your cake! I decorated this one with a gold drip and some fresh flowers. If this tutorial was useful, please click the thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching!